The Archeology of Knowledge by Michel Foucault, Chapter 1, continued. It is also clear that this description of discourses is in opposition to the history of thought. It is also clear that this description of discourses is in opposition to the history of thought. Thereto, a system of thought can be reconstituted only on the basis of a definite discursive totality. But this totality is treated in such a way that one tries to rediscover beyond the statements themselves the intention of the speaking subject, his conscious activity, what he meant, or again, the unconscious activity that took place despite himself. In what he said, or in the almost imperceptible fracture of his actual words. In any case, we must reconstitute another discourse, rediscover the silent murmuring, the inexhaustible speech that animates from within the voice that one hears. Reestablish the tiny, invisible text that runs between and sometimes collides with them. The analysis of thought is always allegorical in relation to the discourse that it employs. Its question is unfailingly, what was being said in what was said? The analysis of the discursive field is orientated in a quite different way. We must grasp the statement in the exact specificity of its occurrence, determine its conditions of existence, fix at least its limits, establish its correlations with other statements that may be connected with it, and show what other forms of statement it excludes. We do not seek below what is manifest, the half-silent murmur of another discourse. We must show why it could not be other than it was, in what respect it is exclusive of any other, how it assumes, in the midst of others and in relation to them, a place that no other could occupy. The question proper to such an analysis might be formulated in this way. What is this specific existence that emerges from what is said and nowhere else? We must ask ourselves what purpose is ultimately served by this suspension of all the accepted unities, if, in the end, we return to the unities that we pretended to question at the outset. In fact, the systematic erasure of all given unities enables us, first of all, to restore to the statement the specificity of its occurrence, and to show that discontinuity is one of those great accidents that create cracks, not only in the geology of history, but also in the simple fact of the statement. It emerges in its historical eruption. What we try to examine is the incision that it makes, that irreducible and very often tiny emergence. However banal it may be, however unimportant its consequences may appear to be, however quickly it may be forgotten after its appearance, however little heard or however badly deciphered we may suppose it to be. A statement is always an event that neither the language nor the meaning can quite exhaust. It is certainly a strange event. First, because on the one hand, it is linked to the gesture of writing or to the articulation of speech. And also, on the other hand, it opens up to itself a residual existence in the field of a memory or in the materiality of manuscripts, books, or any other form of recording. Secondly, because, like every event, it is unique, yet subject to repetition, transformation, and reactivation. Thirdly, because it is linked not only to the situations that provoke it, and to the consequences that it gives rise to, but at the same time, and in accordance with a quite different modality to the statements that precede and follow it. But if we isolate in relation to the language and to thought the occurrence of the statement, event, it is not in order to spread over everything a dust of facts. It is in order to be sure that this occurrence is not linked with synthesizing operations of a purely psychological kind. The intention of the author, the form of his mind, the rigor of his thought, the themes that obsess him, the project that traverses his existence and gives it meaning, and to be able to grasp other forms of regularity, other types of relations. Relations between statements, even if the author is unaware of them, even if the statements do not have the same author, even if the authors were unaware of each other's existence. Relations between groups of statements thus established, even if these groups do not concern the same or even adjacent fields, even if they do not possess the same formal level, even if they are not the locus of assignable exchanges. Relations between statements and groups of statements and events of a quite different kind, technical, economic, social, political, to reveal in all its purity the space in which discursive events are deployed is not to undertake to reestablish it in an isolation that nothing could overcome. It is not to close it upon itself. It is to leave oneself free to describe the interplay of relations within it and outside it. The third purpose of such a description of the facts of discourse is that by freeing them of all the groupings that purport to be natural, immediate, universal unities, one is able to describe other unities, but this time by means of a group of controlled decisions, providing one defines the conditions clearly. It might be legitimate to constitute, on the basis of correctly described relations, discursive groups that are not arbitrary and yet remain invisible. Of course, these relations would never be formulated for themselves in the statements in question, unlike, for example, those explicit relations that are posed and spoken in discourse itself, as in the form of the novel or a series of mathematical theorems. But in no way would they constitute a sort of secret discourse, animating the manifest discourse from within. It is not, therefore, an interpretation of the facts of the statement that might reveal them, but the analysis of their coexistence, their succession, their mutual functioning, their reciprocal determination, and their independent or correlative transformation. However, it is not possible to describe all the relations that may emerge in this way without some guidelines. A provisional division must be adopted as an initial approximation, an initial region that analysis will subsequently demolish and, if necessary, reorganize. But how is such a region to be circumscribed? On the one hand, we must choose empirically a field in which the relations are likely to be numerous, dense, and relatively easy to describe. And in what other region do discursive events appear to be more closely linked to one another, to occur in accordance with more easily decipherable relations than in the region usually known as science? But, on the other hand, what better way of grasping in a statement, not the moment of its formal structure and laws of construction, but that of its existence and the rules that govern its appearance, if not by dealing with relatively unformalized groups of discourses, in which the statements do not seem necessarily to be built on the rules of pure syntax? How can we be sure of avoiding such divisions as the oeuvre, or such categories as influence, unless, from the very outset, we adopt sufficiently broad fields and scales that are chronologically vast enough? Lastly, how can we be sure that we will not find ourselves in the grip of all those over-hasty unities or synthesis concerning the speaking subject? or the author of the text. In short, all anthropological categories, unless, perhaps, we consider all the statements out of which these categories are constituted. All the statements that have chosen the subject of discourse, their own subject, as their object, and have undertaken to deploy it as their field of knowledge. Question mark. This explains the de facto privilege that I have accorded to those discourses that, to put it very schematically, define the sciences of man, in quotation marks. But it is only a provisional privilege. Two facts must be constantly borne in mind: that the analysis of discursive events is in no way limited to such a field, and that the division of this field itself cannot be regarded either as definitive or as absolutely valid. It is no more than an initial approximation that must allow relations to appear that may erase the limits of this initial outline. Chapter 2, Discursive Formations. I have undertaken, then, to describe the relations between statements. I have been careful to accept as valid none of the unities that would normally present themselves to anyone embarking on such a task. I have decided to ignore no form of discontinuity, break, threshold, or limit. I have decided to describe statements in the field of discourse and the relations of which they are capable. As I see it, two series of problems arise at the outset. The first, which I shall leave to one side for the time being and shall return to later, concerns the indiscriminate use that I have made of the terms statement, event, and discourse. The second concerns the relations that may legitimately be described between the statements that have been left in their provisional, visible groupings. There are statements, for example, that are quite obviously concerned and have been from a date that is easy enough to determine with political economy or biology or psychopathology. There are others that equally obviously belong to those age-old continuities known as grammar or medicine. But what are these unities? How can we say that the analysis of headaches carried out by Willis or Charcot belong to the same order of discourse? That Petty's inventions are in continuity with Newman's econometry? That the analysis of judgment by the Port Royal grammarians belongs to the same domain as the discovery of vowel gradations in the Indo-European languages? What, in fact, are medicine, grammar, or political economy? Are they merely a retrospective regrouping by which the contemporary sciences deceive themselves as to their own past? Are they forms that have become established once and for all and have gone on developing through time? Do they conceal other unities? And what sort of links can validly be recognized between all these statements that form in such a familiar and insistent way such an enigmatic mass? Question mark. First hypothesis, and the one that, at first sight, struck me as being the most likely and the most easily proved. Statements different in form and dispersed in time form a group if they refer to one and the same object. Thus, statements belonging to psychopathology all seem to refer to an object that emerges in various ways in individual or social experience and which may be called madness. But I soon realized that the unity of the object, madness, does not enable one to individualize a group of statements and to establish between them a relation that is both constant and describable. There are two reasons for this. It would certainly be a mistake to try to discover what could have been said of madness at a particular time by interrogating the being of madness itself, its secret content, its silent, self-enclosed truth. Mental illness was constituted by all that was said in all the statements that named it, divided it up, described it, explained it, traced its developments, indicated its various correlations, judged it, and possibly gave it speech by articulating in its name discourses that were to be taken as its own. Moreover, this group of statements is far from referring to a single object formed once and for all, and to preserving it indefinitely as its horizon of inexhaustible ideality. The object presented as their correlative by medical statements of the 17th or 18th century is not identical with the object that emerges in legal sentences or police action. Similarly, all the objects of psychopathological discourses were modified from penal or Esquirol to Bleuler. It is not the same illnesses that are at issue in each of these cases. We are not dealing with the same madman. One might, perhaps one should conclude from this multiplicity of objects that it is not possible to accept as a valid unity forming a group of statements, a discourse concerning madness. Perhaps one should confine one's attention to those groups of statements that have one and the same object. The discourses on melancholia or neurosis, for example. But one would soon realize that each of these discourses in turn constituted its object and worked it to the point of transforming it altogether, so that the problem arises of knowing whether the unity of a discourse is based not so much on the permanence and uniqueness of an object as on the space in which various objects emerge and are continuously transformed. Would not the typical relation that would enable us to individualize a group of statements concerning madness then be the rule of simultaneous or successive emergence of the various objects that are named, described, analyzed, appreciated, or judged in that relation? The unity of discourses on madness would not be based upon the existence of the object madness. Or the constitution of a single horizon of objectivity. It would be the interplay of the rules that make possible the appearance of objects during a given period of time. Objects that are shaped by measures of discrimination and repression. Objects that are differentiated in daily practice, in law, in religious casuistry, in medical diagnosis. Objects that are manifested in pathological descriptions. Objects that are circumscribed by medical codes, practices, treatment, and care. Moreover, the unity of the discourses on madness would be the interplay of the rules that define the transformations of these different objects, their non-identity through time, the break produced in them, the internal discontinuity that suspends their permanence. Paradoxically, to define a group of statements in terms of its individuality would be to define the dispersion of these objects, to grasp all the interstices that separate them, to measure the distances that reign between them. In other words, to formulate their law of division. Second hypothesis, to define a group of relations between statements, their form and type of connexion. It seemed to me, for example, that from the 19th century, medical science was characterized not so much by its objects or concepts as by a certain style, a certain constant manner of statement. For the first time, medicine no longer consisted of a group of traditions, observations, and heterogeneous practices, but of a corpus of knowledge that presupposed the same way of looking at things, the same division of the perceptual field, the same analysis of the pathological fact in accordance with the visible space of the body, the same system of transcribing what one perceived in what one said, same vocabulary, same play of metaphor. In short, it seemed to me that medicine was organized as a series of descriptive statements. But there again, I had to abandon this hypothesis at the outset and recognize that the clinical discourse was just as much a group of hypotheses about life and death, of ethical choices, of therapeutic decisions, of institutional regulations, of teaching models, as a group of descriptions, that the descriptions could not, in any case, be abstracted from the hypothesis, and that the descriptive statement was only one form, the descriptive statement was only one of the formulations present in medical discourse. I also had to recognize that this description has constantly been displaced, either because from Bichat to cell pathology, the scales and guidelines have been displaced, or because from visual inspection, occultation, and palpation to the use of the microscope and biological tests, the information system has been modified, or again, because from simple anatomo-clinical correlation to the delicate analysis of physiopathological processes, the lexicon of signs and their decipherment has been entirely reconstituted, or finally, because the doctor has gradually ceased to be himself the locus of the registering and interpretation of information, and because beside him, outside him, there have appeared masses of documentation, instruments of correlation, and techniques of analysis which, of course, he makes use of, but which modify his position as an observing subject in relation to the patient. All these alterations, which may now lead to the threshold of a new medicine, gradually appeared in medical discourse throughout the 19th century. If one wished to define this discourse by a codified and normative system of statement, one would have to recognize that this medicine disintegrated as soon as it appeared, and that it really found its formulation only in Bichat and Laennec. If there is a unity, its principle is not therefore a determined form of statements. Is it not rather the group of rules which, simultaneously or in turn, have made possible purely perceptual descriptions, together with observations mediated through instruments, the procedures used in laboratory experiments, statistical calculations, epidemiological or demographic observations, institutional regulations, and therapeutic practice? What one must characterize and individualize is the coexistence of these dispersed and heterogeneous statements. The system that governs their division, the degree to which they depend upon one another, the way in which they interlock or exclude one another, the transformation that they undergo, in the play of their location, arrangement, and replacement. another direction of research, another hypothesis. Might it not be possible to establish groups of statements by determining the system of permanent and coherent concepts involved? For example, does not the classical analysis of language and grammatical facts from Lancelot to the end of the 18th century rest on a definite number of concepts whose content and usage had been established once and for all? The concept of judgment, defined as the general normative form of any sentence. The concepts of subject and predicate, regrouped under the more general category of noun. The concept of verb, used as the equivalent of that of logical copula. The concept of word, defined as the sign of a representation, etc. In this way, one might reconstitute the conceptual architecture of classical grammar. But there too, one would soon come up against limitations. No sooner would one have succeeded in describing with such elements the analysis carried out by the Port Royal authors, then one would no doubt be forced to acknowledge the appearance of new concepts. Some of these may be derived from the first, but the others are heterogeneous and a few even incompatible with them. The notion of natural or inverted syntactical order, that of complement, introduced in the 18th century by Bosé, may still no doubt be integrated into the conceptual system of the Port Royal grammar. But neither the idea of an originally expressive value of sounds, nor that of a primitive body of knowledge enveloped in words and conveyed in some obscure way by them, nor that of regularity in the mutation of consonants, nor the notion of the verb as a mere name capable of designating an action or operation, is compatible with the group of concept used by Lancelot or Duclos. We must admit, therefore, that grammar only appears to form a coherent figure. And that this group of statements analyzes descriptions, principle analysis, descriptions, principles, and consequences, deductions that has been perpetrated under this name for over a century is no more than a false unity? Question mark. But perhaps one might discover a discursive unity if one sought it not in the coherence of concepts, but in their simultaneous or successive emergence, in the distance that separates them, and even in their incompatibility. One would no longer seek an architecture of concepts sufficiently general and abstract to embrace all others and to introduce them into the same deductive structure. One would try to analyze the interplay of their appearances and dispersion. Lastly, a fourth hypothesis to regroup the statements, describe their interconnection and account for the unitary forms under which they are presented, the identity and persistence of themes in sciences like economics or biology, which are so controversial in character, so open to philosophical or ethical options, so exposed in certain cases to political manipulation. It is legitimate in the first instance to suppose that a certain thematic is capable of linking and animating a group of discourses like an organism with its own needs, its own internal force, and its own capacity for survival. Could one not, for example, constitute as a unity everything that has constituted the evolutionist theme from Buffon to Darwin? A theme that in the first instance was more philosophical, closer to cosmology than to biology. A theme that directed research from afar rather than named, regrouped, and explained results. A theme that always presupposed more than one was aware of, but which, on the basis of this fundamental choice, forcibly transformed into discursive knowledge what had been outlined as a hypothesis or as a necessity. Could one not speak of the physiocratic theme in the same way? An idea that postulated beyond all demonstration and prior to all analysis the natural character of the three ground rents, which consequently presupposed the economic and political primacy of agrarian property, which excluded all analysis of the mechanisms of industrial production. Which implied, on the other hand, the description of the circulation of money within a state, of its distribution between different social categories, and of the channels by which it flowed back into production, which finally led Ricardo to consider those cases in which this triple rent did not appear, the conditions in which it could form, and consequently to denounce the arbitrariness of the physiocratic theme. But on the basis of such an attempt, one is led to make two inverse and complementary observations. In one case, the same thematic is articulated on the basis of two sets of concepts, two types of analysis, two perfectly different fields of objects. In its most general formulation, the evolutionist idea is perhaps the same in the work of Benoit de Maillet or Bourdieu or Diderot, and in that of Darwin. But, in fact, what makes it possible and coherent is not at all the same thing in either case. In the 18th century, the evolutionist idea is defined on the basis of a kinship of species, forming a continuum laid down at the outset, interrupted only by natural catastrophes, or gradually built up by the passing of time. In the 19th century, the evolutionist theme concerns not so much the constitution of a continuous table of species as the description of discontinuous groups and the analysis of the modes of interaction between an organism whose elements are interdependent, and an environment that provides its real conditions of life. A single theme, but based on two types of discourse. In the case of physiocracy, on the other hand, Quesnay's choice rests exactly on the same system of concepts as the opposite opinion held by those that might be called utilitarists. At this period, the analysis of wealth involved a relatively limited set of concepts that was accepted by all. Coinage was given the same definition, prices were given the same explanation, and labor costs were calculated in the same way. But on the basis of this single set of concepts, there were two ways of explaining the formation of value according to whether it was analyzed on the basis of exchange or on that of remuneration for the day's work. These two possibilities, contained within economic theory and in the rules of its set of concepts, resulted on the basis of the same elements in two different options. It would probably be wrong, therefore, to seek in the existence of these themes the principles of the individualization of a discourse. Should they not be sought rather in the dispersion of the points of choice that the discourse leaves free? In the different possibilities that it opens of reanimating already existing themes, of arousing opposed strategies, of giving way to irreconcilable interests, of making it possible with a particular set of concepts to play different games, question mark, rather than seeking the permanence of themes, images, and opinions through time, rather than retracing the dialectic of their conflicts in order to individualize groups of statements. Could one not rather mark out the dispersion of the points of choice and define prior to any option, to any thematic preference, a field of strategic possibilities? Question mark. I am presented, therefore, with 4 attempts, 4 failures, and 4 successive hypotheses. They must now be put to the test concerning those large groups of statements with which we are so familiar, in which we call medicine, economics, or grammar. I have asked myself on what their unity could be based. On a full, tightly packed, continuous, geographically well-defined field of objects? What appeared to me were rather series full of gaps, intertwined with one another, interplays of differences, distances, substitutions, transformations. On a definite normative type of statement, question mark, I found formulations of levels that were much too different and functions that were much too heterogeneous to be linked together and arranged in a single figure, and to simulate from one period to another, beyond individual oeuvres, a sort of great uninterrupted text on a well-defined alphabet of notions, one is confronted with concepts that differ in structure and in the rules governing their use, which ignore or exclude one another, and which cannot enter the unity of a logical architecture. On the permanence of a thematic, what one finds are rather various strategic possibilities that permit the activation of incompatible themes, or, again, the establishment of the same theme in different groups of statement. Hence, the idea of describing these dispersions themselves, of discovering whether between these elements, which are certainly not organized as a progressively deductive structure, nor as an enormous book that is being gradually and continuously written, nor as the oeuvre of a collective subject, one cannot discern a regularity, an order in which their successive appearance, correlations, and in their simultaneity, assignable positions in a common space, a reciprocal functioning, linked and hierarchized transformations. Such an analysis would not try to isolate small islands of coherence in order to describe their internal structure. It would not try to suspect and to reveal latent conflicts. It would study forms of division. Or again, instead of reconstituting chains of inference, as one often does in the history of the sciences or of philosophy, instead of drawing up tables of differences, as the linguists do, it would describe systems of dispersion. Whenever one can describe between a number of statements such a system of dispersion, whenever between objects, types of statement, concepts, or thematic choices, one can define a regularity, an order, correlations, positions, and functionings, transformations. We will say, for the sake of convenience, that we are dealing with a discursive formation, thus avoiding words that are already overladen with conditions and consequences, and in any case inadequate to the task of designating such a dispersion, such as science, ideology, theory, or domain of objectivity. The conditions to which the elements of this division, objects, mode of statement, concepts, thematic choices, are subjected, we shall call the rules of formation. The rules of formation are conditions of existence, but also of coexistence, maintenance, modification, and disappearance in a given discursive division. This, then, is the field to be covered. These the notions that we must put to the test, and the analysis that we must carry out. I am well aware that the risks are considerable. For an initial probe, I made use of certain fairly loose but familiar groups of statements. I have no proof that I shall find them again at the end of the analysis, nor that I shall discover the principle of their delimitation and individualization. I am not sure that the discursive formations that I shall isolate will define medicine in its overall unity, or economics or grammar in the overall curve of their historical destination. They may even introduce unexpected boundaries and divisions. Similarly, I have no proof that such a description will be able to take account of the scientificity or non-scientificity of the discursive groups that I have taken as an attack point, and which presented themselves at the outset with a certain pretension in scientific rationality. I have no proof that my analysis will not be situated at a quite different level, constituting a description that is irreducible to epistemology or to the history of the sciences. Moreover, at the end of such an enterprise, one may not recover those unities that, out of methodological rigor, one initially held in suspense. One may be compelled to dissociate certain oeuvres, ignore influences and traditions, abandon definitively the question of origin, allow the commanding presence of authors to fade into the background, and thus everything that was thought to be proper to the history of ideas may disappear from view. The danger, in short, is that instead of providing a basis for what already exists, instead of going over with bold stroke lines that have already been sketched, instead of finding reassurance in this return and final confirmation, instead of completing the blessed circle that announces, after innumerable stratagems and as many nights, that all is saved, one is forced to advance beyond familiar territory, far from the certainties to which one is accustomed, towards an as yet uncharted land and unforeseeable conclusion. Is there not yet a danger that everything that has so far protected the historian in his daily journey and accompanied him until nightfall, the destiny of rationality and the teleology of the sciences, the long, continuous labor of thought from period to period, the awakening and the progress of consciousness, its perpetual resumption of itself, the uncompleted but uninterrupted movement of totalizations, the return to an ever-open source, and finally, the historico-transcendental thematic may disappear, leaving for analysis a blank, indifferent space, lacking in both interiority and promise? Question mark. That's the end of chapter 2.